So welcome to the second video in the series on Aquinas' 5 ways, and in this one we're going to take a look at the first way, the argument from motion to the existence of an unmoved mover. I'll assume that you've taken a look at the text of Aquinas' argument and read through it, so I won't bother to read through the whole paragraph of the first way, but I will go through it step by step and then comment on it, and then you can, if you've got the text in front of you, you can follow along. That might be a useful way to do it. So as I said in the first video, the first way is known as the argument from motion to the existence of an unmoved mover. This is an argument that goes back to Aristotle, really even earlier than Aristotle, to Aristotle's teacher Plato, who in his dialogue The Laws presents an argument for an unmoved mover of the world. But Aristotle, in his book The Physics, I think it's book 8 of the Physics, and book 12, if I remember correctly, of the Metaphysics, where he repeats the argument, Aristotle develops the argument in more detail than Plato did, and moreover, he presents it in a way that had a direct influence on Thomas Aquinas' presentation of this argument. Aquinas actually presents versions of this argument in different places in a number of different works, and probably the longest presentation is in the Summa Contra Gentilis, the other massive 5-volume work of Aquinas's. In the Summa Theologiae, the text that we're looking at, where it's the first of his 5 ways, it's presented in a much more truncated form, only about a paragraph in a modern book. Okay, so Aquinas presents the argument in a way that, as I say, borrows heavily from Aristotle and makes use, crucially, of certain philosophical assumptions, particularly about the nature of motion or change, that he derives from Aristotle. And so we need to comment on those as we go along. The argument starts out with the following line. I've got the text in front of me here again. Hopefully you have it in front of you. But if not, you can just look at it later as you're listening to the video here. It starts out, the first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. And then he continues, it's certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. So let me pause there and just comment on these first couple lines. First of all, Aquinas says that the first and more manifest way of what? Of proving God's existence. Aquinas, this is not only first in the sense of first on the list of the 5 ways, but Aquinas also takes it to have a kind of fundamental or primary character in the overall project of arguing for God's existence through philosophy, because he says it's the more manifest way. What does that mean? He thinks that of the 5 ways and of arguments for God's existence more generally, the argument from motion is the one that is, say, the easiest to understand for the non-philosopher. It's the one that makes God's existence as something demonstrable through philosophical reasoning more manifest or obvious or clear than any of the other arguments. Not that he thinks the other arguments aren't clear, but he thinks there's a special clarity to the argument from motion. And the reason for that is that the reality of motion is something that kind of hits you in the face in everyday sensory experience. I mean, as you're just watching this video now, you can see me moving my hands, moving my head, my mouth, and so forth. You can see the fan above me and behind me. And so in that sense, the argument from motion starts with a fact about experience that's about as obvious as anything could be. Contrast that, for example, with what he's going to say in the third way, where he starts, which is called the argument from contingency to a necessary being. And as I explained in the first video, what's contingent is what exists but didn't have to. It could have failed to exist. It's capable of either existing or not existing. And so it's capable of coming into existence and passing out of existence. And then he argues from that there could only be such things if there's something that's not like that, something that exists in a necessary rather than a contingent way. Well, I mean, once you kind of spell it out, it's not that difficult to understand. And again, we'll say more about it in a couple of videos from now. But nevertheless, the idea of contingency requires something in the way of philosophical explication. It's not something that just strikes you immediately upon perceiving the world around you. Whereas the fact that things are moving or changing does strike you as obvious just from everyday experience, from any particular experience at all, since experience typically involves observation of some kind of change, even if it's just observing your own thoughts as you go from one thought to another. So in that way, the starting point of the first way, he takes to be the most natural starting point of all, and the one that's most obvious to the man on the street, you might say, without any sort of philosophical preparation. Now, continuing, he says, the first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. Now, the word motion requires a bit of commentary here as well. A couple times now I've said motion or change, as if those words are interchangeable. And in Aquinas and in Aristotle, on whom Aquinas is building, they are more or less interchangeable, because Aquinas is using the term motion, as Aristotle does, in a way that includes change of any kind. Now, that includes 4 basic kinds of change, or 3, depending on how you count. What you count as change. I'll comment on that in a moment. It's a bit of a technical point. But the first of the 4 would be what Aquinas would call local motion, which is change of location from one point in space to another, as when I move my hand from one side to the other. That's a local motion, or change with respect to location. Now, that's what we usually think of when we hear the word motion these days. We think of a body moving through space. A person walks across the room, say, or a baseball flies through the air after you've thrown it, or a planet orbits the sun, say. And that is indeed a kind of motion or change. But for Aristotle and Aquinas, it's again only one of 4 kinds of change. The second would be what's called quantitative change, which is a change in the amount of something, like the change of size that a person undergoes as he gets older and gains weight and so forth. That's a quantitative change, or a quantitative motion, using motion in this broad sense. Then there's qualitative change, like when you get sunburn and your skin turns red, say, because you've been out in the sun too long. That's a change of qualities of color in that case. Or take a banana that ripens as you leave it on the windowsill. It goes from being green to being yellow, say. Okay, that's a qualitative change. Then a 4th kind of change would be substantial change, a change from one substance to another, as when you swat a fly, say, and it goes from being a fly, that's one kind of substance, or independently existing entity, that's one way you could define a substance, to just being a little pile of chemical remains of a fly. It's no longer a fly, it's something else. It's just the chemical constituents that are left when you smash the fly. Or if you think of a banana as a kind of substance, technically it would be really a part of a substance, a tree, but forget about that for the moment. If you think of the banana as a substance, to oversimplify, then you throw a banana in the fireplace and it's turned to ash. Now it's a different kind of substance, ash. It's not a piece of fruit anymore. Okay, so that's a 4th kind of change, substantial change from one substance to another. So we've got these 4, again, local motion, quantitative change, qualitative change, and substantial change. And to make good on my promise, I'll briefly explain why I say that it's 3 or 4, depending on how you count, kinds of change. For Aristotle and Aquinas, change in the strictest sense is change to a substance. So take my banana example. I throw the banana through the air, and the banana goes from one point in space to another. But the banana survives that change. The very same banana that I threw is the one that lands on the couch, say. So the substance persists through the change in its location. Or if the banana is, let's say it gets rotten and it starts to shrivel as it sits out on the windowsill, so it loses quantity, it takes up less space because it's become dehydrated. That's a quantitative change. But the same object, the banana, survives that change. It's a ripe banana, now it's a rotten banana, but it's still a banana, you might say, even though it's undergone this quantitative change. Or when the banana ripens and it goes from green to yellow, that's a qualitative change. But again, the banana has survived the change. It's the very same banana that's yellow that used to be green. So for Aristotle and Aquinas, change in the strict sense is change to a substance, meaning the substance carries on, the object carries on, even though it's lost one feature and gained another. It's undergone change. Substantial change is a more radical kind of change, because it's not change of it's not change of a substance. It's not a substance gaining or losing some feature. It's rather the substance going out of existence altogether and being replaced, as when the banana is thrown into the fireplace and turned to ash. The banana doesn't survive that change. That's a much more radical kind of change. And so if we use change in the narrower sense, only the first 3 would be change, and the 4th would be something different. The whole loss of a substance and its replacement. Well, that's a little technical aside, and for purposes of the first way, you can basically ignore it. But if there are any viewers who are familiar with Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy and would be annoyed with me if I didn't note that qualification, I thought I'd throw it in there. All right. So if we want to use change in a broad sense, again, we could say there are four kinds: local motion, qualitative change, quantitative change, and substantial change. Any of those would be a fitting starting point for the first way, for the argument from motion. It's an argument from change. We observe in the world around us change occurs, and it can be any of those four kinds, and any of them would be, as I say, a suitable starting point to get the argument off the ground. Okay. Aquinas, as you'll recall, the beginning of the argument here also says that the fact of change is evident to our senses. It's evident to sensory experience. This is another important feature of Aquinas' five ways in general. All of them start with what we know from sensory experience. They are all, in that sense, arguments a posteriori, to use the jargon, where a posteriori is Latin for from afterward, or as a result of, like posterior to, or after, as a result of experience, perception, seeing things, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling things. As opposed to what? Well, as opposed to knowing something a priori, or independently of sensory experience. These are two basic kinds of knowledge. We know through experience, we know apart from experience. The sorts of things we might know independently or apart from experience would be things like truths of arithmetic, that 1 and 1 equals 2, that 2 times 2 equals 4. These things we know just by understanding the concepts involved in the statements. We can see they have to be true. We don't have to rely on observation or experiment. Whereas a posteriori truths are ones we know through the senses, through seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. Now, in Aquinas' opinion, the only way to know God's existence is ultimately a posteriori. That is to say, through truths that we know from the senses. And we reason from what we know to the senses to something that we cannot sense, namely God. We can't literally see, hear, taste, touch, or smell God, but we can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell other things, like the changes that occur in the world around us, and we can reason from that to the existence of God. Now, here Aquinas differs from other philosophers, such as, for example, St. Anselm of Canterbury, one of his predecessors in the medieval philosophical tradition, and in Christian philosophy in particular. St. Anselm, some of you might know, in his famous ontological argument, tries to prove God's existence through pure reason without relying on sensory experience. He thinks you can, just by knowing the definition of God as a greatest conceivable being, you can conclude that God must exist in reality, because it's greater to exist in reality than not to. So if God's the greatest conceivable being, he must exist in reality by definition, etc. That's St. Anselm's ontological argument. And it's an argument that proceeds from pure ideas rather than from anything we know through the five senses. That's not the kind of reasoning that Aquinas likes. He doesn't think that's really ultimately a way to come to know metaphysical realities like the existence of God. For that, he thinks we have to rely on sensory experience. And he has reasons for this which go beyond anything we need to get into for purposes of understanding the five ways. But it's worth noting as we go along here and look at the arguments that all of them start with truths that we know only through sensory experience. In the case of the first way, that would be the reality of motion or change. Okay, so that's the first couple lines and a little bit of commentary on them. Now, continuing with the argument, Aquinas says, now whatever is put in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except that it is in potentiality towards that to which it is in motion. Whereas a thing moves in as much as it is in act or actual. Okay, what is all that? I mean, that, I understand, sounds like gibberish if you're not familiar with the terminology here. So what's Aquinas saying in this, to modern ears, somewhat obscure set of lines here? To put it simply, what he's saying is this. He's saying, look, what motion or change involves, fundamentally, is the actualization of potential. To move or change is to go from being potential to being actual. That's what it involves. So, for example, when the banana is thrown across the room, or if I just move my hand from one side of the screen to the other here, those are both kinds of local motion. We see the actualization of potential. The banana is actually in my hand, say, and then I throw it across the room to the couch, and now it's on the couch. So originally it was potentially on the couch, and now it's actually on the couch. Or my hand is actually on this side of the screen and only potentially on the other side, and now I actualize that potential. So the potential of my hand to be moved is actualized as I flex my muscles there. Or a qualitative change, like the banana changing color. It's originally actually green and potentially yellow, and as it ripens, it becomes actually yellow. It goes from being potentially yellow to being actually yellow. Now, all kinds of change on analysis for Aquinas involve the actualization of potential in this way. That's the nature of change. And that's an idea that goes back also to Aristotle. Aristotle developed this in reaction against earlier thinkers like the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, who denied that change was real. Parmenides notoriously said that if change was going to occur, it would have to involve going from non-existence to existence. Like in the case of the banana ripening, Parmenides would say, well, originally it's green, then it becomes yellow. And if the change really occurred, that means that the yellow, which is initially non-existent, would have to become existent, would have to go from non-existence to existence, would have to go from non-being to being, from nothing to something. And then Parmenides says, wait, that's impossible. You can't get something from nothing. So since change would involve that, change must be an illusion. So Parmenides argued. Aristotle pointed out in response that Parmenides is overlooking a middle ground between nothingness or non-existence on the one hand and what he calls actuality on the other. And that middle ground is potentiality. When the banana ripens and it goes from being green to being yellow, the yellowness, you might say, is already there in the banana potentially. It's not actually yellow yet, but it does have the potentiality to be yellow. And it has a potentiality in that case that where it doesn't have other potentialities. So the banana, for example, it doesn't have the potentiality to fly around the room by itself or to grow legs and walk around. Bananas don't have that potentiality. But they do have the potentiality to turn yellow. And so since they do, you can say the potentiality to turn yellow is something really there in the banana. It's not a fiction. It's not nothingness, even though the yellowness is not actual yet either. And so in Aristotle's view, and Aquinas building on Aristotle, we can understand what makes change possible and answer these weird skeptical arguments presented by earlier thinkers like Parmenides by noting that change involves going not from nothing to something, but from potentiality to actuality, where potentiality, it's not actuality, but it's not nothingness either. It's a kind of middle ground reality between actuality on the one hand, a kind of full reality, and nothingness on the other. Well, that's the background, and it's, kind of truncated and sketchy, but hopefully that gives you enough of an idea here. The background to what is going on in Aquinas when he says that change involves the actualization of a potential. And he also wants to say that nothing can go from potential to actual unless something already actual makes that happen. So go back to the example of the hand. I move my hand from one side of the screen to the other, and so my hand is initially actually on one side and potentially on the other. When that potential is actualized, as it is when I actually move my hand, that's because something already actual, say the firing of the relevant motor neurons in my nervous system, actualizes the potential of the muscles to move the arm. And so in that case, something already actual, namely the activity in the nervous system, actualizes the potential of something else, namely the motion of my hand. And in general, Aquinas wants to say that nothing can go from potential to actual, and so nothing can change, unless something already actual makes that happen. Because a potentiality by itself can't do anything, because it's only potential, it's not actual. So if a potentiality is going to be actualized, something already actual has to make that happen. All right. And so that's what that beginning phase of the argument is all about. We see change occur around us, like the motion of my hand or the ripening of a banana or what have you. And that always involves, all change involves the actualization of potential. The hand goes from being potentially on one side of the screen to being actually that side as I move it. Or the banana goes from being potentially yellow to being actually yellow as it ripens. So we know change occurs. We know that change involves going from potential to actual. And we know that that cannot happen unless something already actual makes it happen. Okay. For example, the firing of the motor neurons in my nervous system has to actualize the potential of the muscles to move the hand across the screen, and so forth. Okay. Well, when that occurs, to stick with my example, the motor neurons fire to cause my muscles to flex, to cause my hand to move. The motor neurons, in turn, of course, are going from potential to actual. I mean, initially, before they fire, they're only potentially firing. And they actually fire only when something makes that happen, namely further activity in my nervous system. So some other set of neural events in the nervous system, cause the relevant motor neurons to fire, which cause my muscles to flex, which cause my hand to move across the screen. So that we've got a series, you might say, of movers or actualizers, right? The motion of the hand is actualized by the flexing of the muscles. The flexing of the muscles is actualized by the firing of the motor neurons. The firing of the motor neurons is actualized by the firing of yet other neurons further back in my nervous system, and so on and so forth. And so this is the next stage of the argument, as Aquinas presents it in the Summa, that we have a series of movers or changers, a series of actualizers, you might say. Okay. Now, how far back can this go, right? If we have one thing actualized by another, which is in turn actualized by another, which is in turn actualized by another. For example, again, the movement of my hand is actualized by the flexing of the muscles, which is actualized by the firing of the motor neurons, which is actualized by the firing of yet other neurons, which is actualized, no doubt, by the firing of yet other neurons further back in the system, and so forth. How far back can this sort of series extend? Can it go on to infinity? Can it go back without a beginning, as it were? What Aquinas wants to say is that that's not possible even in principle. He wants to say that if we supposed that the series of movers or changers, the series of what we might call actualizers, went back infinitely with no beginning, then there would be no motion or change at all, including the motion that we started out with, namely, in this example, the motion of my hands, say. And Aquinas wants to say that that's not possible. Okay. Now, why is that not possible? Why does Aquinas think this? Here we have to come back once again to something I noted briefly in the first video in this series, which is that when Aquinas is arguing for the existence of a first mover, or in the rest of the five ways, for the existence of a first cause or a necessary being or what have you, he's not engaged in the following kind of reasoning. He's not saying that if we trace the series of events back in time to the Big Bang, we've got to ask what caused the Big Bang, and then we've got to say, well, God caused the Big Bang, and so forth. Where then you might then ask, well, how do we know God still exists? Maybe he knocked down that first domino 13 billion years ago at the Big Bang, but is no longer around, and so forth. Well, as I noted in the first video, when Aquinas argues for God's existence, including in the first way, he's not interested in the history of the universe, you might say. He's not interested in tracing causes backward into the past and getting to a beginning point like at the Big Bang and arguing, what caused the Big Bang. That's not what he's talking about. Rather, what he's talking about is tracing causes here and now back to a first unmoved mover operating here and now. And here we come then to another crucial background idea, a crucial background philosophical assumption that Aquinas makes use of in giving the first way. And this crops up again in other arguments in the five ways as well. And that is the distinction between what he calls essentially ordered causal series versus accidentally ordered causal series. Or contemporary commentators sometimes call it the distinction between hierarchical causal series and linear causal series. And it's only one of those two that Aquinas is interested in when he presents the five ways, and the first way in particular. And it's only one of those that he has in mind when he argues that the series of causes cannot go back to infinity. So we need to understand this distinction in order to understand why he thinks that the series cannot go back infinitely, but has to have a starting point. So let me explain the distinction here. Starting with cause and effect series that are linear in nature, or as Aquinas puts it, accidentally ordered. What would that be? Well, first thing we can note about this kind of series is that the kind of series we typically have in mind, we think of a series of causes and effects extending forward and backward in time. Aquinas gives the example to illustrate this idea of a father begetting a son who in turn begets another son who in turn begets yet another. So we have a series of fathers and sons, and obviously then grandfathers and great-grandfathers and so forth. So imagine that Al begets Bob. Bob in turn later on begets Chuck, where begetting is just the flip side of conceiving. When pregnancy occurs, we say a woman's conceived and the father has begotten. Okay, so imagine Al begets Bob, Bob begets Chuck, Chuck begets Dave, Dave begets Ernie, and so forth, and the series continues over many generations. Now, that's an example, and it's Aquinas' stock example of what he calls, again, an accidentally ordered causal series. I'll explain that, the reason for that label in a moment. Or what's also called a linear causal series, because you can think of it as like a straight line of causes extending forward and backward in time. And ultimately, it's the kind we might trace back to the Big Bang, say, if that's the sort of thing Aquinas was interested in when giving his arguments for God's existence. But as I keep saying, that's not what he's interested in. So he's not interested in linear or accidentally ordered causal series. Well, what other kind is there? Well, these he would contrast with what he calls essentially ordered causal series, also known as hierarchical causal series. And to illustrate this idea, he gives the example of a hand which someone's using to move a stick to in turn move a stone. So imagine, I don't have a stick here, but I got a pencil, right? Imagining I was using this pencil to push some stone across the surface of my desk here, across the ground, say. Okay. That would be an example, again, of what he calls an essentially ordered causal series, what contemporary commentators call a hierarchical causal series. And notice that one thing about this causal series, one important feature of it, is that it is simultaneous. The causes and effects, unlike the case of the fathers begetting sons and so forth, which extend forward and backward in time, in the case of this hierarchical causal series, they all exist simultaneously. At the very moment that the stone is being pushed by the stick, or the pencil in this case, the stick is in turn being moved by the hand, which at the very same moment is being moved by the arm, which at that very same moment is being moved by me, by virtue of the firing of the neurons of my nervous system and so forth. So the causes and effects here are simultaneous. The stone is being moved by the stick, which is being moved by the hand, which is being moved by the flexing of the arms of the muscle. All of that action occurring simultaneously or at the same moment. We're not tracing it backward in the past, but you might say tracing it upward or downward, depending on what metaphor you prefer, here and now. Now, that's the basic idea of these two kinds of cause and effect series, but we can note some further features of them. In the case of the linear or accidentally ordered causal series, which extends forward and backward in time and extends backward into the past, maybe forever, maybe back to the Big Bang. It doesn't matter for Aquinas' argument. But in that kind of cause and effect series, the members of the series operate in an independent way. The members have, you might say, a kind of built-in causal power. So I say Al begets Bob, who in turn begets Chuck, who in turn begets Dave, and so forth. And the idea is that once Al begets Bob, and then Bob grows up, Bob can go on to beget Chuck or have a son of his own, Chuck, even if Al is no longer in the picture, even if Al has died off. Because Bob has a kind of built-in causal power or ability to produce sons of his own, to beget a son of his own. He doesn't need Al still to be around in order for that to happen. The causes and effects can operate independently. Now, that's very different from the essentially ordered or hierarchical sort of causal series, like the hand using the stick to push the stone. The stick has no built-in causal power, no power on its own to bring about effects. If I weren't using this pencil or a stick in order to push the stone, the pencil or the stick would just lie there inert. It wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't be pushing a stone, for example. So it can push the stone, but only insofar as I'm using it as a kind of instrument to push the stone. Short of that, it's inert. It's got no built-in causal power. And then the same thing's true of my hand. My hand, just left to itself, let's say if the muscles of my arm were numb or something, or my arm were disabled, my hand would just lie there limp. I wouldn't be able to move the stick and thereby move the stone. So each member of that series, you might say, has its causal power in a borrowed or derivative way. The stick can move the stone, but not under its own steam. It needs to borrow the power to do that from the hand. So it's the hand using the stick to move the stone. and the stick by itself would not be able to do that. And all the members of an essentially ordered or hierarchical series are like that, at least all the members other than the first. Now this brings us to the next difference between these two kinds of causal series. With a linear causal series, or one that extends forward and backward in time, there's no reason in principle, in Aquinas' opinion, why that sort of series could not extend backward into the past without a beginning. Why? It's precisely because the members of the series have a kind of built-in causal power. Again, once Bob comes into existence, he can go on and grow up to have a son of his own, Chuck, even if Al dies off. His own father, Al, dies off. Got a built-in power to do that. He doesn't need Al still to be around working through him, as it were, to beget Chuck. And so for that reason, in a linear or accidentally ordered causal series, the present members can operate even though the earlier members have died off. You don't need them still to be around. You don't need the earlier members of the series still to be around in order for the current members to operate. And so for that reason, since you don't need any particular earlier member of the series for the series to go on, maybe there is no earliest member. Maybe the series goes back infinitely. For all Aquinas wants to say, for all we know, or at least for all we need to know, just for the purposes of the first way, we don't need to suppose that there was a first human being or that there was a beginning of the universe. Now, again, Aquinas thinks there was because of what's said in Scripture, but he thinks as far as philosophy by itself is concerned, we can't know one way or the other apart from divine revelation, but it doesn't matter. We don't need to for purposes of the first way. Because what he's concerned with is the other kind of cause and effect series, the kind that operates here and now. The essentially ordered causal series, like the example of the hand using the stick to push the stone. Again, the stick has no power to move the stone on its own. It has whatever power it has to move it, only insofar as it borrows it from the hand. But the hand, in turn, has no power to move the stick on its own. It can move the stick, which goes on to move the stone, only insofar as, say, the motor neurons are firing to cause the hand to move, to cause the stick to move, to cause the stone to move, where, again, all of this is going on here and now simultaneously. So what we've got here is a series of movers where each member of the series has only derivative or borrowed causal power. The stick borrows its power to move the stone from the hand. The hand borrows its power to move the stick from the motor neurons, say. But notice that the motor neurons, which are caused to fire by yet other motor neurons and so forth, they can do all this only because they stay in existence at any particular moment. My whole nervous system stays in existence at a particular moment to allow me to move my hand so that I can move a stick, so that I can move a stone, and so forth. And that involves a more fundamental kind of relation of dependence, where the very existence of the cells of my body, the cells that make up my nervous system, at any moment presuppose or depend on other things going on at that moment. For example, they depend on the fact that the particles that make up my body constitute a nervous system, say, as opposed to some other kind of object. The particles that make up my body, the molecules, could, after all, in theory, make up some other kind of object, but they don't. They make up a nervous system here and now. So something has to actualize that potential. So what we've got here is a series, all existing of members, all of which exist here and now, where one member exists only because it's actualized by another, which is here and now actualized by another. The motion of the stone is actualized here and now by the motion of the stick, which is actualized here and now by the motion of the hand, which is actualized here and now by the firing of the neurons. And the existence of the neurons is actualized here and now by the fact that the particles are constituted so that they form neurons. And so we've got one level of reality actualized here and now by another level, which is actualized in turn by yet another level, and so on and so forth. What Aquinas wants to say is we've got, in this case, is one level which exists only because it's actualized by another, which is actualized by another, where each level is, you might say, borrowing its causal power from another level. And you can't borrow causal power unless there's something to borrow it from. And if this series went back to infinity with no beginning point, we would have a series of things borrowing causal power with nothing to borrow it from. And that makes no sense. So what he wants to say is that an essentially ordered or hierarchical causal series, the kind that's operating here and now, has to terminate in something that can actualize everything else in the series without having to be actualized. And this is what he calls what you can call a purely actual actualizer. It actualizes without having to be actualized. It moves or changes other things without having to be moved or changed itself. It just is, you might say, fully actualized always and already, and it doesn't need to be actualized by anything else. And so for that reason, it can count as a first mover. Now, let me try to wrap all this together to make it intelligible, the whole flow of the argument here. So Aquinas starts out by noting that we observe that things are moving or changing in the world around us, in the world of our experience, like the hand moving the stick, moving the stone, like the banana ripening on the windowsill, like my hand moving across the screen, or what have you. And motion or change always involves the actualization of potential, and a potential can be actualized only if something else already actual actualizes it. And if that thing is itself being actualized, if it's being made to go from potential to actual, there must be yet some further thing making that happen. And what we're talking about here is a series of movers or actualizers that's all operating here and now simultaneously. But where this kind of series can exist at all, only if there is a first member of the series that actualizes everything else without having to be actualized itself. Something that is a purely actual actualizer. It has no potentiality in it that's waiting to be actualized. Hence, it can actualize other things without having to be actualized itself. It can move or change other things without itself being moved or changed. And so it is a truly first member of the series. Now, that's a very abstract characterization of God, to think of God as pure actuality, a purely actual actualizer which actualizes other things without being actualized itself. Can we say more about this? About the nature of this unmoved mover, or purely actual actualizer, or unchanging changer, however you want to put it? The answer is yes. But Aquinas doesn't get into that in the first way. At the end of the first way, he just says, and this we call God. What he means by that is, whatever else God is, we take God to be the ultimate explanation of why anything exists or occurs in the world. And so in reasoning from the fact of motion to an unmoved mover or a purely actual actualizer, we have reason to the existence of God. But of course, there's much more to God than that. And so in the sections of the Summa Theologiae after the five ways, he starts to derive some of the divine attributes. He argues, for example, that for something to be an unmoved mover or a purely actual actualizer, since it has no potentiality, but is already, as it were, fully actual, it would have to be something that is changeless or unchangeable, because change involves going from potential to actual. A purely actual actualizer has no potentiality that's waiting to be actualized. Therefore, there's no way for it to undergo change. So it must be immutable or changeless. It must also be immaterial or not a physical object, because physical objects are always capable of change, of having their matter rearranged and becoming something else, for example, or of moving from one point in space to another. Since a purely actual actualizer has no potentiality and cannot change, it must not be a material thing either. It must be non-material or non-physical. It must be timeless or outside of time and space, because whatever is in time and space can undergo change. And just going through time involves going from one state to the next. That involves change. So if the unmoved mover is immutable or changeless, it must also be outside of time and space. Power involves making things happen, making things go from potential to actual. But if every time anything goes from potential to actual, that traces back to the unmoved mover, then the unmoved mover must be the source of all power, of all ability to make things happen, to make things go from potential to actual. And so it must be all powerful. And so on. Now I'm condensing all these arguments into a very brief space, but what I'm trying to do is give you a sense of how he continues from the point he leaves off in the first way, in later parts of the Summa Theologiae, to give arguments for the divine attributes in some detail. And through other lines of argument, he argues that the unmoved mover must be all-powerful, all-knowing, must be unique, there cannot be more than one of them, and so on and so forth. But hopefully I've said enough to give you a sense of how that kind of argumentation proceeds. Okay, so that's a little overview then of the first way and the basic strategy of the argument. I hope you find that helpful. We'll move on in the next video to look at the second way, the argument from efficient causality to a first uncaused cause. All All right, so we'll see you then in the next video.